Good morning. It's a privilege to again come and to preach the Word of God, especially on this particular Sunday and this weekend, which we know is Memorial Day. Decided to preach a sermon that I called Generations, only because of the sense that it involves memorials. If you travel to Washington, D.C., Beverly Jo and I lived there for a few years and did ministry there in Washington, D.C. We lived only about 5 miles from the White House for a number of years. And you can't travel around Washington, D.C. without noticing that there are monuments everywhere. Whether it's the Washington Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, we have the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, the Korean War Memorial, the Vietnam Memorial, World War II Memorial. Our capital of our nation is filled with monuments everywhere. Now, there's a purpose for those monuments. They're there for a specific reason. They exist to remind us that every generation prior to our generation paid a sacrifice and paid a cost for us to enjoy the freedoms that we do today and to be able to live the way we live today. And that those costs were, those freedoms came at quite a high price, came at a great extensive price tag in the way that people lived. And there's some pictures there. I'll show you some of the monuments that are in the Washington, D.C. area. They're there to remind us today to appreciate what we have by recalling yesterday's sacrifices. That really is the whole point of Memorial Day every year that we have on our calendar. There was incidences in the scriptures where there was some similar concepts that were played out. One of those was at the end of the Exodus, when the Israelites were about ready to cross finally, after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness because of their disobedience. They finally find themselves once again at the Jordan River, ready to cross into the Promised Land. The second generation finally being able to enter. And when they do, they find that their life has not only been full of challenges for 40 years in the wilderness, but coming to the Promised Land didn't end the challenges that they were going to have to face. In fact, they get to the Jordan River, and what does the scriptures tell us in Joshua chapter 3? It says they arrived at flood stage. And so here they were trying to get across, and it was the flood stage of the Jordan River, which meant it was impossible to cross, especially with a couple million people. And they were going to have to rely on God to help get them over another challenge. This was kind of the final challenge in their journeys in the Exodus. And God offers Joshua to go back to the people to tell them to break camp the next morning, to get ready. In Joshua 3, you can read this, and in chapter 4 as well, where he goes through the camp with the leaders and tells them in 3 days they're going to be crossing this muddy, flooded Jordan River and entering the Promised Land. And so he says something kind of interesting. He tells the Israelites, listen, you don't move until God moves. Now, that's the first thing we always have to remember when we're faced with challenges, is we don't do anything until God does something. And in this particular case, God, through Joshua, was telling the people, look, you're going to get up and march, and you're going to walk through this muddy Jordan River. But here's how that's going to happen. The priests are going to take up the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders, and they're going to be the first ones to go and step in this muddy, quick, raging river, this swollen river called the Jordan River. And you get behind them, and when they step into the waters carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the waters are going to part. Now, this was a different miracle from Moses' miracle at the Red Sea. Same kind of miracle, but it was done in a different way. It was a different leader, a different time. And God doesn't usually do the same miracles the same way twice, even if it's the same kind of miracle. And you remember with Moses, he just took the staff that God had given him, struck the Red Sea, and it parted, and they walked across on dry ground. Well, they were going to need a similar miracle, and that the Jordan was going to have to part, and they were going to have to go across on dry ground. But this time the miracle involved Joshua, not Moses. And the style wasn't going to be with a shepherd's staff. This time it was going to be with carrying the Ark of the Covenant, which is very instructive here, because while they were in a flood, they were in a time of difficulty, when it was impossible to fulfill the command of God to go into the promised land. God says, look, I'm not asking you to go someplace that I'm not willing to go first. So God was basically saying to them through this, the priests, these Levites and priests are going to carry the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was significant. It had three basic ingredients in that ark at all times. It had Aaron's rod that had budded, which showed the anointing of the high priest that was chosen by God to be the priest over the nation, which was a symbol of the future Messiah who would be the high priest over everyone. And it had the manna that they had eaten in the wilderness for 40 years. There was a sample of that in there, the bread of life, so to speak. And that was a symbol also that the Messiah one day would be the bread of life. And then, of course, the Ten Commandments were inside this Ark of the Covenant, which stood for God's Word. And in John, we read that Jesus was the Word made flesh and dwelt among us. So all three of these elements were prophetic for the future Messiah, but what the Ark of the Covenant represented for Israel was God's very presence. In fact, when the ark went somewhere, they were to follow, because that was God leading them. They were probably distressed when they got to the Jordan River to cross over into the Promised Land to discover it was at flood stage, and they said, well, now what? And God says, don't worry, I've got this covered, because I'm not asking you to go into the flood if I don't go in there first. Now, of course, this was a combined thing, because not only was God, the Ark of the Covenant wasn't just going to magically float into the river and part the waters, but the priests in Israel had to carry the ark on their shoulders, which was heavy, by the way, made of acacia wood and overlaid with gold. It was obviously very heavy, had tablets of stone in it too. And for the priests, they had to trust that God was good to his word, and carrying it into those muddy waters, they would have perished otherwise. But God basically was telling his people, look, I'll go first into the flood. And when you see these waters part, you follow me. And they were instructed to be several thousand yards behind them. And then they were supposed to cross over while the priests stood in the center of the river as the waters were parted and held the ark there until everybody got across safely. And if you read in Joshua chapter 3, you'll read some of these verses where they were instructed what to do. They were to cross over once the ark was in it. And what a sight. I mean, talk about a sight. This must have been quite a sight for the children of Israel to watch their priests, their spiritual leaders, lift up the presence of God, this Ark of the Covenant, and walk into the flood stage, into the flood waters. Now, to put a New Testament parallel to this, in the New Testament, we're all priests, and the priesthood of all believers. So the parallel here is that if we want our kids to know how to go through tough times and how to survive stages of life where floods come and unexpected things happen, like this whole COVID-19 thing, they have to be willing to see us bear up the presence of God in front of their eyes and carry it into these flooded situations, these terrible situations that come that seem impossible to get through. And only as they see us carry the presence of God in our lives, on our shoulders, in a sense, carry it, and we stand in the midst of these floods and these difficult circumstances, will they understand that the presence of God makes the difference. And so it's really important for us to remember that. So here they watch their spiritual leaders bear up the Ark of the Covenant and face the problems of life by bearing up the presence of God and walking into the flood stage. There had been tough times in the wilderness. There were going to be tough times in the Promised Land. But by the way, the Promised Land wasn't just a time of ease, because when they got into the Promised Land, in the wilderness, God had fed them for 40 years. The manna had helped keep their enemies at bay and guided them and directed them, provided water supernaturally through a rock, through bitter waters that were turned fresh. And so you'd think going into the Promised Land was going to be a great relief. But the truth is, God told him through Joshua that the day you go into the promised land, the manna stops. And then you have to drive out the Perizzites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, all those Ite brothers. They had to be driven out by warfare. So this was not going to be a picnic. This was not going to be where they had 40 years of difficulties and now they're going to just have the rest of their life be easy. In fact, it starts with a flood. And once they got past the flood and they crossed over, that was one great miracle, yes. But there were more miracles that were going to be needed as they faced a lot of bitter enemies and a lot of time of taking over the promised land. So it wasn't that life was going to be a journey of just ease. And life is never a journey of ease. It doesn't mean because we're Christians that we don't have difficulties or we don't have to go through difficult times. This COVID-19 has hit saint and sinner alike everywhere in the world. Hopefully what's different about God's people is that we know we're carrying the presence of God on our shoulders. He's in us and he's upon us. And as people witness our lives, even in the midst of a flood or of a difficulty, they should see that we're trusting God in the very midst of the floodwaters to be with us. And of course, that's what made the difference. I mean, every one of us has difficult things that come into life. My personal life, I was almost killed by a motorcycle accident in 1970. I was in a coma for 8 days. Car hit me head on. Many people know that story. I sustained brain damage at that time, and yet God brought me through that. In fact, changed my field of ministry because at the time I was in a secular college studying biology, so I was planning on doing a pre-med degree. So that changed the whole course of my life. From that experience in God's healing, I went into ministry. My older brother Gary, who worked in the Pentagon, that's how I even knew about the Assembly of God Church there in Arlington. He was killed in a terrorist attack. And it was when my sister-in-law was 6 months pregnant with their second child. So we knew losses. My mom, when I was a kid growing up in my early teen years, my mom came down with colorectal cancer. And we didn't know, that was pre-chemo days, so there wasn't chemotherapy, it wasn't a standard treatment. All they did was heavy radiation, and they didn't know if she would survive. Well, we trusted God. God was gracious and healed her. And then later in life, she came down with it again, but God healed her a second time in her late 70s and early 80s, and she lived to be 85 years old. So we've had some difficulties in my life, in our family. We've gone through some flood stages and seen some difficult things. And in every one of those cases, we had the presence of God that our family leaned on in the middle of those floodwaters, and it sustained us and kept the floodwaters back from overtaking us. Israel was about to actually face more enemies going into the promised land that they faced in the wilderness. As I said, there were a lot of Ite brothers over there on the other side. And so they were a little afraid. They were afraid of the floodwaters. They were afraid going into a strange new environment. They had to be a little apprehensive by the fact that the manna was going to cease, which meant they had to fend for themselves for food while they were taking over a whole nation. And God promises, though, that he would be with them. That was what the Ark of the Covenant represented, God's presence with them. I preached on that just several weeks ago about how God is with us. And God promised to be with them, promised to be with Joshua. And so as these priests started to step into the waters, imagine the sight when the Israelites watched all those waters peel back and saw a dry path going through. And as they crossed over, they had to pass by those Levites that were holding the Ark of the Covenant up because they had to stand in the middle of the river the entire time holding the Ark of the Covenant, because as long as God's presence was there, they would not be overtaken by the flood. And by the way, that's still true. No matter what crisis we go through, no matter what tragedy comes our way, in our family's way, in our personal lives' way, as long as God's presence is with us in the middle of those crises, the floodwaters won't overtake us. It doesn't mean that they're not there still. I mean, the floodwaters are still there. They could see the wall of water on both sides. The snows didn't stop. The rains didn't stop. God didn't stop all that. He just piled it up away and gave them a path forward, a path through. that they had to trust that God was going to hold it back while they went through, and they did. And so I don't know how long it took for them to cross, but they crossed over. And as they crossed, it must have been quite a scene, walking through this kind of pathway of a wall of water on one side, a wall on the other side, and these priests holding the Ark of the Covenant in the center of this flood. And as they walk to the other side, they finally all get there, and only then do the priests begin to march out of the waters. But before they leave, Joshua instructs one leader from each tribe to go back. You can read this in Joshua chapter 3. I might throw a verse up there about that. He instructs one man from each tribe to go back and find a small, or not a small, but find a boulder that he could carry. So it couldn't be too large, but it wasn't supposed to be a small pebble either. And to bring each of these 12 men were to carry a rock, a significant sized rock, and bring it to the shoreline before the priests came out of the center of the river. So one man was appointed from each of the 12 tribes. They went and each got a rock, kind of a small boulder that they could carry, and they brought it to the side of the seashore that was inside the promised land. And only then, when they had all 12 of these rocks, did the priests with carrying the Ark of the Covenant finally walk out of the water, and the flood waters went back. Of course, now Israel was in the promised land. They were on the other side. And then God has Joshua do something very significant at this point. While they were all celebrating this tremendous victory, and what a powerful, miraculous thing this was to Israel. I mean, they must have been astounded. Joshua says, look, those 12 stones, I'm going to pile them up. We're not going to cut them or shape them in any way, but we're going to pile them into a monument. And we're going to set it on this side of the Jordan River, inside the promised land, and we're going to set it up as a pillar, as an altar. And it's going to be an altar of remembrance. It's going to be a memorial stone, a memorial altar. And then he describes, and here's the verses for that, he describes what the purpose of this was. He says, someday your children are going to walk by here and say, and he's thinking about future generations now, and kind of like what we do in Washington, D.C. with all these monuments. We have built these monuments to the past generations to teach the new generations to come the sacrifices that were made and what took place for us to have the freedoms we did. So Joshua says, when your children one day walk by here with you, they're going to see that pile of stones standing there as an altar, and they're going to say, what did these stones mean? And you're going to look at them and say, that was the time when God brought us through the floodwaters, and the purpose of doing this was to be instructive to a new generation of what God had done for their previous generation, to give them hope and trust that God, as God was there for their forefathers, God will also be there for them. And the privileges that they enjoy in the promised land today was because of a price tag of their previous generations trusting in God to get them to where they were. This was so important. This was kind of the Memorial Day celebration of the Israelites after the Exodus. It's kind of sad. I've been to Israel, and I've gone through parts of Israel today where these stories took place. And when we were over there for a couple of weeks, I would have loved to have seen this altar still standing. And now in the scriptures, it says when the writer was writing this, it says that altar was still there to this day. But I can tell you that no archaeologist knows where that altar is today, because over a period of many, many years and many generations, that altar wasn't taken care of. And because they weren't hewn stones and they weren't shaped to fit together, what obviously happened is, since they were all just kind of rounded stones of irregular shape piled on top of each other, probably over time when ground shifted or there were mild earthquakes, it probably fell down. Now, at some point, probably occasionally at least, they checked on it and would repair it. If a stone had fallen down, somebody would put it back up. But over a long enough period of time, Somebody forgot to keep doing that. And to this day, we don't know where that monument is. It's not even there. If I was walking across Israel, I would never see that and say, what do these stones mean? And the sad part about that is when we don't have memorials anymore, we don't remember the events that took place that represent those memorials for what we have today. And so there came a sad time in the history of the Old Testament when that monument must have fallen apart, and Jewish descendants may have walked by there and just seen a pile of stones on the ground scattered and never questioned what do those stones mean, because it had ceased to be a monument. It was just a collection of stones on the ground. That's a sad thing. You know, you can't help but go to Washington, D.C. and see all these monuments, and it makes you think about our history and the price tag that was been paid. Well, ironically, we need memorials. We need times, even today. I sometimes wonder, what is this next generation going to know about God from our generation? What have they seen us? Are we building memorials? Are there memorials? There have been memorials in Christendom through history. Some of the great hymns, it's really sad that we don't sing some of the hymns anymore. I know it kind of ages me. But some of the great hymns were actually musical memorials of people's stories of what God had done for them. And it's not just a song, it was a memorial. I'm gonna actually give you a couple examples of that. One was a German hymn that was called Nun Danket alle Gott, Now Thank We All Our God in English. And I want you to watch these videos, and you'll appreciate how these great hymns, which are very well-known hymns, now that you'll see the history on them, you'll understand how they're memorial. And every time you hear it, when I hear these two hymns, that one and It Is Well With My Soul, knowing the memorials, the stories behind them, they become memorials for me. When I hear those songs, I think of these stories and what they represent, and it makes my trust in God just want to soar.
Scriptures teach that as Christians we've been crucified with Christ, and therefore our lives are not our own. In fact, we live in this life by faith. And sometimes that faith is severely tested. There's a hymn called "It Is Well With My Soul." It was written by a man named Horatio Spafford. He was a wealthy lawyer from Chicago, and in 1870, he lost his only son to scarlet fever. A year later, the Great Chicago Fire broke out and wiped out nearly all of his real estate assets. Then, a couple of years later, the economy took a dive, and he was even more affected financially. In order to help boost the family spirits, he sent his wife and 4 daughters overseas to attend a rally by D.L. Moody. At the last minute, he wasn't able to go because of some business concerns, and so he sent them, and he said, "I'll meet up with you shortly." Well, halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, their boat was struck by another vessel, and it sunk to the bottom of the ocean. When Horatio Spafford's wife, Anna, got to a place where she could telegram him about the incident, her message only had 2 words: saved alone. His 4 daughters drowned in the accident. He was obviously devastated, and as he boarded a ship to sail across the ocean to meet up with his grieving wife, he spent many hours on the bow of that ship, looking over the edge at the waters that had claimed the life of his 4 precious daughters. And when he got to about the spot where they perished, he penned these words: "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." That's really the same message that Peter gives us in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 19. He reminds us that sometimes we're going to suffer according to the will of God. But when we do, we're supposed to entrust our souls to a faithful Creator. If our faith is strong enough to do that, we'll be able to say, like Horatio Spafford did, "Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul."
When peace like a river and attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, and whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, and it is well with my soul, and it is well with my soul, and it is well, it is well with my soul, and my sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin not in part, but the whole was nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, praise the Lord, oh my soul. And it is well with my soul. Yes, haste the day when the face shall be sight and the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, and the drum shall resound, and the Lord shall descend, and even so, it is well with my soul, it is well, it is well with my soul, and it is well, it is well with my soul.
Aren't those great? Aren't those great? I mean, just the hymns alone just makes your soul soar. And it's important that we pass on the lessons of one generation to another. That's what we do in our secular history with monuments. As I said, in Washington, D.C., they're created to pass on the history of our nation, of our freedoms, of the fight, of the struggle, of the victory that has been won. We need to do that in the church. I often feel kind of bad when a church is just all young people or all old people, because the church is meant to be intergenerational. It's not meant to be a church of just young people or a church of just old people. It's meant to be both. When I was pastoring, I wanted our church to have young, middle, and old people all at the same time in them, because there was some value to one generation passing down to the next generation important stories of faith. Those elderly people in the church should be monuments, in a sense, of the great things that God had done in their lives, to give courage to the younger people that if God did it for that generation, he can do it for our generation as well. That's one of the important lessons of this story in Joshua, with this monument that was built. That was the whole purpose. God instructed Joshua. That was the whole purpose for it. When your children walk by one day and say, "What do these stones mean?" you can tell them what I did for them, what I did for your fathers, what I did for the generations prior to their being on the scene and enjoying the privileges of the promised land. So they will understand that I'm a God not only of their generation, I'm a God of all generations. I'm a God of history. I'm a God of the present. I'm a God of the future. In fact, this point is made in Revelation when it says Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. The whole point being that God is timeless. And the stories of faith and our lives are living monuments. In fact, it's kind of interesting that Peter picks up in the New Testament and says we're living stones. Well, if we're living stones, we are altars of those stones set up in a wilderness of life. And our kids should see these stones, our living stones, and say, what do these mean? And we should be able to define for them our faith and define for them what God has done for us. To teach that this generation needs to know that God fought for us in our youth. God came through for us when we walked through the tough places. I'll never forget how my mom and dad handled my brother being killed in a terrorist attack, and us having to deal with my sister-in-law being 6 months pregnant at the time. I watched, my parents talked all the time about our faith in God, and making sure that we had trusted the Lord. And it's always easy to trust the Lord in good times because there's no challenge. But when my brother was killed unexpectedly in this terrorist attack, and he died in an instant, from a terrorist bomb. And the news came to our family. I got to watch my mom and dad's faith in living it out in a moment of a flood. Realizing that the presence of God, that the flood was there, we were in the middle of it, but God was there in the middle of it with us, and that made all the difference. I'll never forget at the funeral, I worked for a Jewish man. He had a clothing store, a men's clothing store, and I worked there for a number of years. My mom also worked for a Jewish family that owned a ladies' apparel business, and she was the manager of that store. And so we had a lot of Jewish friends that weren't Christians, didn't believe in Jesus as the Messiah. And then when they came out of respect, because my mom and I worked for these Jewish people, I'll never forget what one of them said at my brother's funeral. They said, we have never really been in a Christian church. We've known Christians, but we have never sensed what we sensed here during your brother's funeral, how your family, though we were in tears and we were struggling over my brother's death and the unexpectedness of it. He was only 27 years old when he was killed. He was killed in uniform. So this Memorial Day is special for those reasons too, for us as a family. My dad served in the Navy. A lot of my family served in the armed forces, different branches. And this Jewish friend said that they were just blown away watching our family sitting together, going through this funeral, this almost sense of peace that was on us in the midst of brokenness. And they couldn't comprehend that. And they were just flabbergasted by it. Well, what they were witnessing was the Ark of the Covenant on our shoulders. We had the presence of God out in the midst of the flood, was on our shoulders, and we were carrying God's presence with us. This generation needs to see that. And it's the older generation's responsibility to demonstrate that so that they can see that. And we want our grandkids and our great-grandkids to come by and see our lives and hear our stories. And ironically, this millennial generation, these young people, they really like old people. They like the stories old people tell because they need that. That's the reference points. Those are the memorial stones, the living stones that we are, as Peter described us. We're those living stones that are set down in a memorial. So how are you building memorials? So what kind of stories are you telling your kids and your grandkids? It's really important. This Memorial Day, I know we're celebrating secularly. In the secular world, we're celebrating our freedoms and our nation and the sacrifices that previous generations have made in war and the lives that have been given for us to have the freedoms we have. And that's a wonderful thing to celebrate. It certainly is right and proper that we do that. But I hope we're celebrating too and creating living memorials in our lives for the next generation so that they will look at our lives and say, what do these lives mean? What do these old people mean by they walked with God, that they had faith in God? So we want to pass on the lessons of walking with the Lord. The future is always built on the past. And that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. We stand on the shoulders of people who went before us. I'm well aware in ministry that many of the good things I've enjoyed in ministry were not because Dennis Marquardt was so brilliant and so good, but because I had a grandfather who was an Assembly of God minister. I knew the stories from my mom. She was one of 8 kids who was a pastor's kid. My mom had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. She was one of 8. She was one of the 4 girls. And the stories I grew up hearing, how during the Depression, my grandfather trusted God and ministered as an Assembly of God minister to many, many churches, and how God provided food on the table for 8 kids during the Depression years. Those all were with me when we left Washington, D.C. and moved to Virgins. And I was having to trust God for next week's salary or next paycheck when we only had 6 people in the church. And then, after a few months, we might have had 15 people in the church. But I want to tell you, I was able to do that because of the monuments, the living stones of my grandfather. My uncle was an Assembly of God minister. I have cousins that were Assembly of God ministers. The stories of previous generations sustained me in my faith at being able to trust God that somehow he was going to make it work in Virginia, Vermont when we went there to plant a church. And so, friends, what are you showing your kids? How is the church today upholding? We want to honor those who have gone before us, spiritually as well as in the secular world. Those hymns were so precious. There's a wonderful old story, and I'll close with this, where Babe Ruth was at the end of his career, and of course he was one of the greatest home run hitters of history. At the end of his career, he was striking out more than he got hits. His health was declining, and he was often committing errors, and he wasn't quite as popular as he once had been. Once in Cincinnati during a game, he had played very poorly. The crowd began to boo in large masses. Dejected and hurt, Babe Ruth kind of hung his head down on his chest and began to walk off the field when a little boy came running out with tears streaming down his cheeks, and he grabbed the leg of Babe Ruth and just clung to him because he was so distressed as a young boy over his hero, his baseball hero, being booed by the crowd. Well, when the crowd saw this young boy with the tears coming down his cheeks and hugging Babe Ruth's leg, as Babe Ruth was dejected and walking off the field being booed by the crowd, the entire crowd suddenly became completely silent and quiet as the scene played out with this boy hugging Babe Ruth's leg. In just a second, the young boy had recognized the life of Babe Ruth as a great player and quieted the momentary criticism of the crowd for the moment that they didn't like that he was in. And suddenly his whole memorial was brought to life by this little boy in that moment, and it ceased the complaints of the crowd. You know, we need to see the bigger picture of life to appreciate what God does in our lives. The older I get, the more I appreciate how God has been with me every stage of my life and everything that God has done. And God's not through with us. He's not through with my generation. He's not through with this next generation, and he's not through with the generation after. But I do want to build memorials. I want my life to be a memorial. I hope you do too. Can I pray with you? And we'll close this in prayer. Father, thank you that you create moments in life, Lord, where you help us shine with your presence. We can go through floodwaters. We can go through facing enemies like Israel did when they went into the promised land and they had to drive out the inhabitants. That meant warfare, that meant fighting, that meant struggle. Lord, Christians struggle too, just like everybody else. We go through sicknesses, we go through difficult times, we go through flood stages. But Lord, I hope that we will show the world that as priests unto God, we carry his presence like the Ark of the Covenant. We carry his presence in our hearts and our lives into those very flooded water, those flood and waters, and into those difficult circumstances, and that makes us different than those in this world. And Father, as living stones, may our lives be continually a memorial before others of what God does do, what he is willing to do, what he will continue to do. Father, touch those who are listening today. I pray they will be strengthened by this message. Thank you for those who have sacrificed for our freedoms today, both practically and in the secular world, but also, Lord, in the spiritual realm. We thank you for those who have gone before us and upheld the faith in Jesus Christ. May we do the same, I pray, into every generation, and I give you thanks for that in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you. Thanks for being with us.